And so that's how I got into it. And then I started going down the rabbit hole and I realized, I was asking these basic questions like, okay, how many people get evicted every year? Like, no one knows. Like, okay, who's disproportionately affected? No one knows, unless you're in communities that are feeling the effect of that housing crisis. And so we had a lot of books on jobs, on welfare policies, on the criminal justice system, but housing was this huge part of the puzzle that seemed to be missing. I started getting into this because I wanted to try to write a book about poverty in the United States that didn't focus just on poor families. We had a lot of books on folks like single moms or homeless vets. We had a lot of books on low-income communities, and I learned a lot from those books, but it felt like something was missing. It felt like we were treating low-income communities as if they lived in isolation from everyone else instead of being deeply connected to everyone. And so I thought, what about eviction? Eviction does that. If you write about eviction, you can write about landlords, you can write about social workers, you can write about tenants. And so that's how I got into it. And then I started going down the rabbit hole and I realized, I was asking these basic questions like, okay, how many people get evicted every year? Like, no one knows. Like, okay, who's disproportionately affected? No one knows, unless you're in communities that are feeling the effect of that housing crisis. And so we had a lot of books on jobs, on welfare policies, on the criminal justice system, but housing was this huge part of the puzzle that seemed to be missing. There's kind of an impulse in me when I don't understand something or I want to understand it closer to kind of view it from the sidewalk level, to get close to it personally. And so I started this work the old-fashioned way. I moved into a mobile home park in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I rented a trailer, and I lived in that trailer for about 5 months. And then I moved into a rooming house on the north side of Milwaukee and rented a rooming house. The north side is Milwaukee's segregated African-American community. And I lived in that rooming house for about 10 months. And from those two neighborhoods, just followed families getting evicted. And I went everywhere with those families. I went to eviction court with them. I followed them into abandoned homes and shelters. I watched their kids. I slept on their floor. Went to church with them, AA meetings, a lot of funerals, my first birth, and try to get a view of their life as much as I could. And then I try to do that with their landlords, and try to really get a view of their lives. I wanted to understand their perspectives as well. So I helped fix up their old toilets and went with them as they passed out eviction notices and collected rents. So that's kind of the foundation of Evicted. It started from the sidewalk level, and then it kind of collected a bunch of data about the eviction crisis that we just didn't have, kind of drawing from original surveys, eviction records, 911 records, basically anything I could get my hands on, and taking that big data and making it converse with the small data, my notebooks, the things I was learning on the ground every day, living in the mobile home park around the north side of the city. There's so many. I think that one of the saddest thing I think I saw in Milwaukee was I was spending time with a woman I call Arlene in the book, and when we met, she was a single mom. She was raising 2 young boys, and her rent took 88% of her income, right? So you're living in that kind of situation. You don't need to make a big mistake to get evicted. I mean, you're so close to it every month. And she was spending some time with one of her friends, Trisha, and Trisha moved suddenly, and the movers came. And so you imagine this kind of scene where you're in a 2-bedroom apartment. There are all these kind of men just packing up things in black trash bags, and Arlene is running around trying to find her medication and the cell phone and the things you're going to need tonight, because you're suddenly realizing you're going to be homeless tonight. And then her 7-year-old comes home. He walked home from school. 7-year-old comes up into that scene. And I've got a 7-year-old now, right? If this happened to our family, he would he would ask a question. He would freak out. He'd be terrified. He would run to get his favorite toy or stuffy. But Arlene's kid just took in the scene, and he didn't ask a question, and he didn't cry. He just turned around and went outside to play. Mm-hmm. Because he's seen that scene before. And, you know, if eviction has become normalized to children like that, yeah, that's something I think the country should be incredibly embarrassed by. There's a lot. You know, when I first crunched the numbers in Milwaukee, you kind of come to this statistic about 1 in 30 renter homes every year is evicted. And in the inner city, it's about 1 in 14. So I put this book out, and I would go to Baton Rouge, or I'd go to Seattle, and folks would say, well, they'd ask this question, you know, how's Seattle doing? You know, what works? You know, is Milwaukee weird? Is it really out there? And we didn't have any answers to that question, yeah, you know? And so the federal government doesn't collect eviction data, which is like not knowing how many Americans get cancer every year or graduate from high school every year. Yeah. And so, so for the past 3 years, my team and I at Princeton have been doing that, trying to build this national data set of eviction. So one thing we learned is that Milwaukee, it's not high at all. It's not even the top 50 most evicting cities in the country. You know, I mean, the numbers I saw in Milwaukee were scary. There are cities with double the eviction rate of Milwaukee. And these are not the cities that are often talked about when we talk about the housing crisis. They're not New York or Boston or San Francisco. They're like Tulsa, Oklahoma, Richmond, Virginia. You know, 1 in 9 renter homes every year in Richmond, Virginia is evicted. Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so it showed us that this is a nationwide problem. There is a lot of variation across states, but there's a big story too, which is our old American story, which is about racism. And the communities that are most deeply affected by this happen to be low-income communities of color, particularly African-American and Latino communities. The history of America is, in part, a history of systematically dispossessing people from the land. This obviously is something that Hawaiians know incredibly deeply. And, you know, if you just take the African-American experience, you move from slavery to sharecropping, you get the Great Migration in the 1920s, only to have families to be ghettoized in cities like Chicago and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. That legal segregation lasted for decades, and when it finally fell, it only fell after incredible unrest. It resulted in white flight and the kind of gutting out of the inner city. You kind of trace that up to 2008, where we know now that African-American communities were targeted by predatory loan companies. And now we don't have to really wonder why most white families own their home in the United States and are shielded from the exigencies of the rental market, but most Black families and most Latino families don't. Those are renting families. So that fact alone just disproportionately exposes Black and Latino families to the eviction crisis. The housing policies that we have in the United States, they work pretty darn well. They're not perfect, but they work really well. And you know, when families finally receive a housing voucher after years on the waiting list, and it's just this ticket that allows them to pay only 30% of their income on rent instead of 60 or 70%, you know, studies show they do one consistent thing with their freed up money, which is they buy more food, you know, and their kids become stronger. They move to better neighborhoods. They don't move as much. They work. That's the good news. The bad news is they only reach a small minority of families that qualify for them. So when I wrote Evicted, only about 1 in 4 families who qualify for any kind of housing assistance received it. The data now suggests it's only about 1 in 6. Only 1 in 6 families that need this help get anything, get a housing voucher, get to live in public housing. And I don't know what the waiting list for public housing is in a city like Honolulu, but like in a city like DC, it's not counted in years anymore, it's counted in decades. And so that's where we are, right? It's like if I needed public housing and I applied today in our nation's capital, I would likely be a grandfather by the time my application came up for review. There used to be a time where America did invest in housing, did recognize that everyone needs safe and decent housing, and this is something that the government's going to invest in. That investment was drastically reduced under President Ronald Reagan. Reagan cut HUD's budget by 60%, 60%. And that led to a real failure of public policy, not because the idea of public housing is a failure, although there are definitely sins that we have committed in public housing, including segregating communities in places like Atlanta and St. Louis and Chicago. But I mean, you defund anything 60%, it's going to fail. Take 60% away from a university or a military, it's going to fail. And so that's the hit that we took during the Reagan years, and we never fully recovered from that. I think there's a way to answer that in COVID and a way to answer that for what would we want the world to look like after COVID. I feel like COVID, we need three things immediately from the federal government. One, we need an eviction moratorium. Eviction isn't going to solve anyone's problem. It's not like if a family becomes homeless, a landlord gets $1,000. That's not true. I think that in this climate where we're all kind of sheltering in place, we need to protect just the foundational necessity of a home, especially right now. That's one. The second is we need rent relief. You know, we need a federal investment to take care of all the rental arrears that built up over the last several months when there was a moratorium in place. And there's been studies that have kind of estimated what that level should be. It kind of ranges anywhere from $70 billion to $130 billion, depending on your level of investment. That would do a lot to ease renting families' burden. It would do a lot to allow property owners to keep paying their bills and have a steady income from their investments. And so I think we need that. And the third thing we need right now is that if evictions continue, families that are facing homelessness deserve and need a lawyer by their side. They need to make sure they have a fair shake in a housing court. And that's an incredibly cost-efficient intervention to prevent eviction. So I think those are the three things we need now. In the long run, I think we just need to recognize that without stable shelter, everything else falls apart. And we need to take these programs that work really well, like the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and expand them to everyone below the poverty line. A lot of tenants were asking, hey, I live in North Dakota or I live in Mississippi. What are my rights? We didn't know. And so, you know, the news media was kind of treating moratoriums kind of in a rosy way, saying, hey, states are doing this. So we started digging into the legal documents. We read thousands and thousands of legal documents. And we were like, how do we distill this? And we said, we're going to give a 5-point scale. That's what we're going to do, 5 stars. And so we talked to a lot of tenant advocates out there, and we said, what do you think makes a good moratorium? You know, what are your tenants calling for? And we listened to them, and we kind of built in their advice into the evaluation. And so what makes a good moratorium is if you stop the eviction process at the beginning, middle, and end, right? If you are not allowed to file, to execute, or to like physically remove a family, we think that covers it. Even if you get an eviction filed on you and you end up staying, that can really still affect your life in a real way, right? It can harm your credit. If you want to move out sometime later, it can really affect your housing choices. And then we wanted to see foreclosure moratoriums. We wanted to see stoppages on utility shutoffs. We wanted to see states also get involved and think about how do you maintain the tenancy after these moratoriums lift. So those are the states that did better. It didn't break down along traditional lines. You know, we had states like Montana had a pretty strong eviction moratorium. California did not. New Jersey did not. Massachusetts did. Minnesota did. It's hard to argue with, but a moratorium doesn't pay your rent, you know, and the lack of a moratorium doesn't get you paid. And I think there's an incredibly important possibility now for property owners and tenants to, with one clear voice, say, you know, we need significant investment here. There's another way I think about this too, which is like, what did the data say? What did the data say about how much landlords are making? And what the data say is that in middle class neighborhoods nationwide, the profit margins of landlords are fairly thin. You know, and it seems like this is like an investment vehicle. You know, you kind of put capital in a property and you hope it accrues. and the rents kind of pay the bills as they go along. But in poor neighborhoods, that is not true. In poor neighborhoods, the profit margins of landlords are much more significant. And the reason is very simple, which is that property costs and property taxes are a lot lower, but rents are not that much lower. And so if you rent a 2-bedroom in the poorest neighborhood in Milwaukee, you're basically only paying $50 less than if you rent in like the most swanky, hipster neighborhood in Milwaukee. And so that's a nationwide trend, the compression of rents. And so that suggests like the story about like the domino effect, if tenants don't pay their rent, I can't pay their mortgage, is a story that applies mostly to landlords in non-poor neighborhoods, landlords where most evictions do not take place. When this pandemic hit, we saw a level of tenant organization that has been the culmination of like the last 10 years of organizing since the foreclosure crisis. I think organizers played a key role in getting moratoriums across the country. They're playing a key role in the Cancel the Rent campaign to make sure that, the level of investment in this crisis is at scale. And so I think that, I think organizers have a much better response to that than I would. And clearly organizers in Honolulu need different things and are meeting different challenges than organizers in Detroit. I think that, I think for your listeners that are interested in who those organizations are, they can get involved. And so, when I put the book out, I started a little website just called Just Shelter, justshelter.org. And I list housing and legal aid organizations all around the country putting in work on these issues. So if you're interested in like what organizations are doing this kind of work in Hawaii, you can go to that website, Just Shelter, and get plugged in. I think that, I think direct action matters. I think legal action matters. I think that asking for serious investment from our state and local officials matters as well. There's so many ways we can move the needle here. It's a hard question, not a tricky one. Sorry, it's a hard question because we're in this, situation, economic situation that we haven't seen since the Great Depression, and so, I think in normal times, rental assistance basically says your rent is $1,000, or excuse me, I'm in Hawaii. Your rent is $2,000, so here's $2,000, and that's going to make $85 million go by really quickly. And so I wonder if there's some sort of compromise or some sort of matching effort, some sort of real analysis about what landlords need in this time to pay their bills and to have a fair return on their investment. And sometimes that is what market rent is, and sometimes it's not actually, And so I think that there might be an opportunity to kind of have that broader conversation. I think an investment in things like mediation services too can go a long way to keeping families in their homes. We were in a housing crisis long before COVID, and the renting families in Hawaii know this acutely. 3.7 million eviction filings in 2016, which is our most recent data. That's about 7 filings a minute in America. That is not a situation that's working. About 1 in 40 renting families in America are evicted every year. For African-American families, that's about 1 in 25 among renters. That is not a situation that's working. So my hope is that this is a reality that's seen by more Americans, and more Americans keep demanding a real serious investment in the fundamental need for shelter for everyone here.